It began as a hushed conversation behind Kensington Palace walls, one that aides tried to downplay and courtiers quickly silenced. But the look on Catherine, Princess of Wales, CZZ's face, as she exited that private meeting said everything the palace couldn't. Something was wrong, and it involved a document no one was supposed to see. What was first dismissed as rumor quickly spiraled into a revelation tied to a voice long thought lost Princess Diana herself. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What unfolded behind those closed doors did not resemble an ordinary royal briefing. Those familiar with internal palace rhythms have long insisted that tension has a particular shape: quiet, controlled, almost invisible. But this was different. Reports suggest that Prince William had called for an unscheduled gathering, pulling in Catherine and a select circle of senior advisors with almost surgical precision. No extended staff, no unnecessary witnesses, just a handful of trusted figures, bound not only by duty but by silence. And at the center of that silence sat a single objective file, described by insiders as unusually aged, its contents unknown even to those who carried it into the room. Various interpretations of that meeting describe an atmosphere thick with unspoken understanding, as though everyone present sensed they were crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. Palace administrative streams, ranging from security log leaks to quiet whispers among long-serving aides, suggest that the document had only recently surfaced during what was meant to be a routine archival review. But nothing about this was routine. The moment Catherine emerged, pale, visibly shaken, clutching that file as though it carried weight far beyond paper, it became clear that whatever had been uncovered was not just historical. It was alive. It had consequences. Insiders whisper that William's reaction was even more telling. He did not address the press. He did not offer reassurance. Instead, he withdrew, canceling appearances, retreating from visibility in a way that has rarely been seen from a figure so carefully conditioned to maintain composure. Those familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy note that such withdrawal is never accidental. It signals conflict. It signals reckoning. And above all, it signals that something deeply personal has collided with something profoundly institutional. And then came the detail that shifted everything. The suggestion, quiet at first, almost dismissed, that the document might be connected to Diana's private writings. Not speeches, not public statements, but something far more intimate. Something never meant for the world. Reports from figures close to royal archival processes claim that the language within the file carried a tone unmistakably her own, direct, emotional, and unguarded. And soon, that suggestion sharpened into something far more precise. A letter. A letter addressed not to the institution, not to history, but to William himself. The implications were immediate and unsettling, because if such a letter truly existed, hidden for decades, and only now brought into the light, it raised questions that no one inside the palace could easily answer. Why had it been concealed? Who had made that decision? And perhaps most haunting of all, what had Diana known, or feared, that compelled her to write words powerful enough to be buried for so long? But the chilling truth wasn't just about a rediscovered letter, it was about what Princess Diana chose to say, and why it was hidden for so long. For decades, certain royal documents were believed to be locked away, forever sealed, not by accident, but by design. And among them, insiders now claim, was a letter written in the final months of Princess Diana's life, one that was never catalogued, never disclosed, and never meant to reach the public until now. What makes this revelation so unsettling is not just the idea of a hidden document, but the deliberate nature of its disappearance. Reports suggest the letter was written in mid-1997, during a period already heavy with emotional strain and quiet tension surrounding Diana's life. Those familiar with that time often describe it as a turning point when personal reflection collided with growing distance from the institution she once stood at the center of. And it is within that fragile window, insiders whisper, that this letter was created, not as a formal statement, not as a record for history, but as something far more intimate, far more dangerous, words meant to be felt, not filed. Various interpretations of archival procedures within royal estates suggest that such a document should have followed a clear path, logged, secured, and preserved within official systems overseen by trusted custodians. But this letter, by all accounts, never entered that system. Instead, sources close to estate operations indicate it may have been held separately, possibly within private holdings linked to Diana's personal belongings. That distinction matters, because once a document exists outside official structures, it becomes vulnerable not just to loss, but to deliberate concealment. And that is where the mystery deepens. Royal archivists, according to multiple accounts, were unaware of its existence for years. This was not a case of a misplaced file or a forgotten note buried in storage. It was something else entirely, something that slipped through the cracks in a way that feels almost intentional. Palace administrative streams, ranging from quiet estate reviews to behind-the-scenes catalog updates, now suggest that the letter surfaced only recently during what was described as a routine reassessment of Diana's personal effects. Routine until it wasn't, because the moment it was read, everything shifted. Those who have reportedly seen the document describe it in terms that are difficult to ignore. Deeply personal, emotionally raw, unusually direct, words that do not follow the measured tone expected of royal communication, but instead carry the unmistakable voice of someone speaking without filters, without restraint, and perhaps without the expectation that those words would ever be heard. And that is precisely what gives the letter its weight. It does not feel like something prepared for the world. It feels like something written in a moment of urgency, as though time itself was closing in. And with that realization comes the question that now echoes through the palace. Why was it hidden? Not misplaced, not forgotten, hidden. Because if multiple layers of royal protocol failed to account for its existence, then someone, at some point, made a choice. A decision to keep it out of reach, to ensure it remained unseen. And that decision, perhaps more than the letter itself, is what threatens to reshape everything. Speculation has already begun to build. Some suggest the contents could challenge long-held narratives about Diana's final months. Others believe it may reveal perspectives that were never allowed to surface, truths that were quietly set aside in favor of stability. And within those whispers lies a growing tension, the sense that this is not just a historical discovery, but a turning point. Because once a hidden voice begins to emerge, it does not easily return to silence. But what truly stunned those who first read it wasn't just its existence, it was the message Diana left behind. Those who have seen the letter describe it not as a farewell but as a warning, a message written with urgency, as if Princess Diana knew time was slipping away. And at the center of it all was one name, Prince William. What begins to unfold within those pages, according to those familiar with its contents, is something far more intimate than history ever recorded. This was not a public voice carefully shaped for headlines or diplomacy. This was private, direct, almost unfiltered. Reports suggest the letter was addressed to William personally, not as a future king, but as a son navigating a world that few could truly understand. And that distinction carries weight, because in separating the crown from the child, Diana appears to have written not to the institution, but to the individual who would one day be consumed by it. Insiders whisper that the tone of the letter moves between warmth and urgency, as though each line carries both comfort and caution. It reflects on duty not as a privilege, but as a burden that demands more than it gives. It speaks, according to various interpretations, of emotional isolation, of the quiet distance that forms when trust becomes uncertain and loyalty begins to fracture. These are not abstract ideas. They are lived experiences, shaped by years inside a system where appearances often take precedence over truth. And within that context, Diana's words begin to feel less like reflection and more like preparation. There are also hints, subtle but impossible to ignore, of pressures that were never publicly acknowledged. Those familiar with palace dynamics have long suggested that influence does not always move in visible ways. It operates through proximity, through relationships, through those who stand closest to power. And it is here, insiders claim, that the letter takes a sharper turn. References to those closest to power are described as deliberate, carrying a weight that suggests concern rather than accusation. Not a direct naming, but a warning shaped carefully enough to be understood without being exposed. What makes this even more striking is how the letter is now being interpreted, not simply as a personal message, but as guidance, a roadmap, almost for navigating the monarchy's internal conflicts. Diana, it seems, was not just reflecting on her own experience. She was anticipating what lay ahead. the struggles, the pressures, the invisible lines that would one day surround William as he stepped further into his role. And within that anticipation lies something deeply unsettling: the idea that she saw the future not as a continuation, but as a challenge. Those who have encountered the document describe its tone as layered, loving, undeniably, but also deeply cautionary. It does not comfort without warning. It does not guide without acknowledging risk. It speaks to resilience, but also to awareness. And perhaps most striking of all, it carries a quiet insistence and unspoken plea to remain grounded, to see clearly, and to recognize that not everything within the palace walls is as it appears. And as these interpretations continue to circulate, one realization becomes impossible to avoid. This was never just a letter meant to preserve memory. It was something far more urgent, a message designed to endure, waiting for the moment it would be needed most. And now that moment may have arrived, bringing with it questions that reach far beyond the past and into the uncertain shape of what comes next. But the deeper William read, the more it became clear this wasn't just advice, it was a revelation. Behind the emotional weight of Princess Diana's words lay something even more explosive: a series of statements that, according to insiders, challenged the very foundation of how the royal story has been told for decades. What initially appeared to be a deeply personal message soon revealed layers that extended far beyond emotion and memory. Reports suggest that within the letter were references carefully worded, yet unmistakably deliberate, to internal palace dynamics that had never been publicly acknowledged. Not accusations in the traditional sense, but observations, reflections shaped by lived experience. And it is precisely this tone, measured, restrained, yet undeniably pointed, that has caused such unease among those who have encountered the document. Because these were not the words of speculation. They carried the quiet authority of someone who had seen, endured, and ultimately understood more than she was ever allowed to say openly. Various interpretations of the letter describe passages that hint at strained relationships, not only on a personal level but within the structure of the institution itself. There are suggestions of tension that ran deeper than what was ever presented to the public, pressures that were managed behind closed doors, contained within a system built on control and continuity. Those familiar with the monarchy's inner workings have long acknowledged that stability often comes at a cost. But what Diana's words appear to reveal is the emotional weight of that cost, and how it can fracture trust in ways that are never fully repaired. There are also implications, subtle but impossible to ignore, about key figures who occupied positions of influence during the 1990s. The letter does not name, but it gestures. It points toward moments, toward decisions, toward alignments that shaped the environment in which Diana lived her final years. And in doing so, it raises questions that have lingered for decades without resolution. Why were certain choices made? Who influenced them? And perhaps most importantly, what consequences followed that were never publicly understood? These are not simple questions. They strike at the heart of how the royal narrative has been constructed and what may have been left out along the way. As these interpretations began to circulate quietly among senior figures, the atmosphere within the palace reportedly shifted. What had once been a contained discovery started to feel like an approaching storm. Palace officials, according to multiple accounts, found themselves divided not over the authenticity of the letter, but over its implications. Some argued that its contents were too sensitive, too disruptive, to ever be released. That preserving stability required silence. Others, however, saw a different risk: the danger of concealment in an era where hidden truths rarely remain buried. Because once something begins to surface, it tends to find its way into the light, whether controlled or not. This internal divide has only deepened as the document continues to move, quietly, through the highest levels of royal authority. It is not public, not yet, but it is no longer contained either. Insiders suggest that copies, or at least detailed briefings, have begun reaching individuals whose roles demand awareness of potential crises. And with each new reader, the weight of the letter grows, not just as a historical artifact, but as a living force capable of reshaping perception, both inside and outside the institution. And within that growing tension lies a single, unavoidable reality. This is no longer just about Diana, or even about the past. It is about what happens when a carefully maintained narrative begins to unravel, when long-held assumptions are challenged not by rumor, but by a voice that refuses to stay silent. The question is no longer whether the letter matters. It is how much it will change. But as the contents spread behind closed doors, one question loomed larger than all others. What would Prince William do next? There are moments when history doesn't announce itself, it arrives quietly, in a room, in a letter, in a choice. And for Prince William, this was one of them. What followed the discovery of Princess Diana's letter was not immediate action, but something far more telling: silence. Not the controlled silence of royal protocol, but a deliberate withdrawal that, according to insiders, spoke volumes. Reports suggest William spent hours, possibly days, reviewing the document in complete privacy, returning to it again and again as if searching for something beyond the words themselves. Those familiar with his temperament describe him as disciplined, measured, rarely shaken. And yet, this moment appeared different. Because this was not just history confronting him. This was his mother, speaking across time, in a voice he had never heard before. The outside world began to notice the shift almost immediately. Scheduled engagements were quietly canceled. Appearances postponed without explanation. At first, it seemed like routine adjustment. But as the pattern continued, speculation grew. Palace watchers, seasoned in reading between the lines, recognized the signs of something deeper unfolding behind closed doors. This was not a logistical change, it was a personal reckoning, and the absence of clarity only intensified the sense that something significant was taking place within the inner circle. Inside that circle, discussions were reportedly intense, measured, and deeply divided. Catherine, Princess of Wales, is said to have been at the center of those conversations, offering a steady presence as William navigated what insiders described as one of the most emotionally complex moments of his life. Trusted advisors were brought in, not to dictate a course of action, but to weigh the implications of every possible decision. Because this was not simply about understanding the letter, it was about what came next, and that question carried consequences far beyond personal grief. Those who have observed William over the years often speak of his ability to balance duty with emotion, to carry personal history without allowing it to disrupt the institution he is destined to lead. But this situation, by all accounts, tested that balance in ways few could have anticipated. On one side stood his mother's voice, intimate, urgent, impossible to ignore. On the other stood the monarchy itself, an institution built on continuity, stability, and carefully controlled narratives. And between those two forces, William found himself facing a decision that could redefine both. The emotional impact, according to insiders, was profound. Not explosive, not outwardly visible, but deeply internalized. A quiet intensity that shaped every conversation, every pause, every moment of reflection. Because the letter did not just offer guidance, it demanded interpretation. It asked questions without asking them directly. It revealed truths without fully explaining them. And in doing so, it left William with a responsibility that extended beyond understanding. He had to decide what those words meant, not just for him, but for the monarchy he represents. Within royal circles, that responsibility has already begun to create division. Some believe the letter should remain private, its contents too sensitive to risk public exposure. Others argue that withholding it could create greater instability in the long run, especially if its existence continues to circulate through unofficial channels. This is no longer a matter of secrecy versus transparency. It is a question of timing, control, and consequence. And at the center of that question stands William, carrying both the weight of the past and the expectations of the future. But this was no longer just a private matter, it was a legacy waiting to be decided. As word of the letter spread through the upper corridors of power, it did what few things ever manage: it divided the palace from within. What had once been contained within a small, controlled circle began to ripple outward, touching individuals whose roles demanded both discretion and influence. Reports suggest that senior royals, along with key advisors, were quietly briefed on the existence of the document, and with each briefing came a shift in perspective. This was no longer just a personal matter tied to Prince William and the memory of Princess Diana. It had evolved into something far more complex, a situation with the potential to reshape perception, challenge long-standing narratives, and test the fragile balance between truth and preservation that the monarchy has relied on for generations. Insiders whisper that the divide formed quickly, almost instinctively. On one side were those who viewed the letter as too sensitive to ever be released. Their reasoning, according to various interpretations, was rooted in protection not just of individuals, but of the institution itself. They argued that certain truths, even if deeply personal, carry consequences that extend far beyond their origin. That revealing them could reopen wounds, disrupt carefully maintained stability, and invite scrutiny at a scale the monarchy is not prepared to absorb. To them, silence was not avoidance, it was strategy. But on the other side, a different argument began to take shape, one grounded in the reality of a modern world where secrecy rarely survives for long. These voices, quieter but no less determined, suggested that withholding the letter could create a far greater backlash if its existence continued to circulate without clarity. Because speculation, once it takes hold, tends to expand. It fills gaps with assumption, transforms uncertainty into narrative, and ultimately places the institution in a position where it is reacting rather than guiding. And for an institution built on control, that shift is not just uncomfortable, it is dangerous. Advisors, caught between these opposing views, reportedly began to warn of the broader implications. Not just what the letter contained, but how it would be received if revealed suddenly, without preparation. The public, they noted, does not separate emotional truth from institutional responsibility. It responds to impact, and if that impact is perceived as concealed for too long, the reaction can be swift and unforgiving. This is not speculation born from theory, it is a pattern seen before. Echoed in past moments when the monarchy found itself forced to confront narratives it could no longer contain. And it is within that historical context that the tension deepened. Comparisons began to surface, quietly at first, then with increasing frequency. Parallels drawn to earlier crises, to moments when personal stories collided with public expectation and reshaped the monarchy's image in ways that could not be reversed. Those familiar with these patterns understand that such moments do not unfold gradually. They arrive with force, altering perception almost instantly. And the letter, many now believe, carries the potential to become one of those moments. As these discussions continued behind closed doors, the atmosphere reportedly grew heavier. Not chaotic, not outwardly fractured, but strained in a way that reflects deeper uncertainty. Because this is not a question with a clear answer. It is a conflict between two principles that rarely align: tradition and transparency. One demands preservation, the other demands exposure. And both, in their own way, claim to protect the future of the monarchy. But the final decision wouldn't be made by committees or courtiers, it would rest with one man. In the end, the weight of the past collided with the responsibility of the future, and Prince William stood at the center of it all. What had begun as a private discovery had now evolved into a defining moment, one that demanded more than reflection. It demanded a decision. Reports suggest that William found himself confronting a choice that few in modern royal history have ever faced so directly. Whether to preserve silence in the name of stability, or to acknowledge a truth that could reshape the very institution he is destined to lead. And within that choice lay a tension that could not be easily resolved. Because this was not simply about a document. It was about the voice within it, Princess Diana voice, and what honoring that voice might truly require. Those closest to the situation describe a careful and deliberate process unfolding behind closed doors. Advisors, each bringing their own perspective, presented multiple paths forward. Some suggested a controlled disclosure, a measured release of the letter's contents, carefully framed to preserve context while minimizing disruption. Others argued for permanent concealment, insisting that certain truths, no matter how powerful, carry risks that outweigh their revelation. And between these positions stood William, tasked with weighing not only the immediate consequences, but the long-term impact on a monarchy already navigating an increasingly complex relationship with public trust. At the heart of this decision lies a deeply personal conflict. On one side is the memory of a mother, her words, her experiences, her unfiltered truth. On the other is the role William has been preparing for his entire life, a role that demands restraint, continuity, and an unwavering commitment to the institution above all else. Balancing these forces is not simply difficult, it is transformative, because whichever path he chooses will not just define how the letter is handled, it will define how he approaches leadership itself. Insiders suggest that throughout this process, Catherine, Princess of Wales, has played a quiet but significant role, described as steady, composed, and deeply attuned to the broader implications. Her presence is said to have grounded the conversations, offering clarity in moments where emotion could easily take over. This influence, subtle yet consistent, reflects a partnership that has long been viewed as central to William's approach, one that balances instinct with perspective, feeling with foresight. And in a moment as complex as this, that balance may prove more critical than ever. But even with guidance, the weight of the decision remains his alone, because this is not a matter that can be delegated or deferred. It is a moment that demands ownership, a moment that asks not just what is right, but what is necessary. And within that distinction lies the true challenge. Because what feels right on a personal level may not align with what is necessary for the institution. And yet, ignoring that personal truth carries its own cost, one that cannot be easily measured, but will be felt nonetheless. As the palace waits, as advisors continue to assess and reassess, one reality has already begun to take shape. The existence of the letter has changed something fundamental. It has introduced a new layer of complexity into a system that relies on clarity. It has reopened questions that were once considered settled. And it has placed William in a position where his response will not just address the present, it will echo into the future. But no matter what he chose, one truth had already become impossible to ignore. Some voices fade with time, others grow louder in silence. And Princess Diana, it seems, was never meant to disappear. What began as a hidden document has now become something far more powerful, a symbol, not just of memory, but of influence that refuses to be contained by time or protocol. Reports suggest that the letter has taken on a meaning far beyond its original purpose, evolving into a quiet force that challenges the monarchy to confront a truth it has long managed, shaped, and in some cases, carefully avoided. Because this is no longer just about what Diana wrote. It is about what her words represent, a voice that continues to resonate, even in absence, even in silence. As speculation grows, so too does the public's fascination. Insiders whisper that awareness of the letter, even without full disclosure, has begun to spread beyond palace walls, carried through fragments, interpretations, and carefully guarded leaks. And with each new whisper, the narrative expands. Questions multiply. What did she say? Why was it hidden? And perhaps most importantly, what does it mean now? This growing curiosity is not chance. It reflects something deeper, something enduring, a connection between Diana and the public that has never truly faded, only transformed. Within the palace, the implications are becoming impossible to ignore, because the monarchy is once again being drawn into a familiar position, forced to confront its past while trying to protect its future. Those familiar with royal history recognize this pattern, moments where private truth and public expectation collide, creating pressure that cannot be easily managed or dismissed. And this moment, shaped by the rediscovery of a single letter, carries that same weight. It demands reflection, it demands response. And above all, it demands clarity in a system that has long relied on control. At the center of this unfolding reality stands Prince William, not just as a figure of authority, but as a bridge between two eras, two narratives, two interpretations of what the monarchy is and what it must become. On one side is the legacy of Diana, defined by emotion, connection, and a willingness to challenge the boundaries placed around her. On the other is the institution itself, built on tradition, continuity, and an unwavering commitment to stability. And in bridging these worlds, William carries a responsibility that extends far beyond the immediate decision before him. What makes this moment so significant is not just the content of the letter, but how it reframes Diana's place within the royal story. No longer confined to memory or tribute, her voice now reemerges as both personal and historic, an influence that continues to shape the narrative in real time. It forces a reconsideration of what has been accepted, what has been assumed, and what may still remain unseen. And in doing so, it transforms the letter from a private message into something far more profound, a catalyst for reflection, for change, and perhaps for a deeper understanding of the monarchy itself. Yet even as these ideas take shape, one reality remains clear. This story is not finished. Its impact is still unfolding, its consequences still uncertain. The letter may have been written decades ago, but its meaning is being defined now, in decisions yet to be made, in truths yet to be revealed. And as those decisions draw closer, the sense of anticipation only grows stronger. Because when a voice like Diana's re-enters the conversation, it does not simply echo, it transforms everything around it. And as the echoes of her words continue to ripple through the palace, one thing is certain: this is only the beginning of what's yet to come. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in the next one.